Welcome to the Daily News Currents. Today is Wednesday, December 11th, and for today's headlines we have Kroger and Albertsons grocery mega merger halted by 2 courts. An Afghan museum that buried its artifacts after Taliban takeover is reborn online. She revolutionized medicine. Why isn't she a household name? Resist Trump? On immigration, top Democrats see room for compromise. Monarch butterflies are recommended for protected status. Kroger and Albertsons grocery mega merger halted by two courts. State Attorney General. What would be the biggest grocery merger in U.S. history is now in legal peril after 2 years of delays. The companies could choose to continue their legal appeals or abandon the deal. They await another ruling in the third lawsuit in Colorado. Kroger runs many family grocery stores, including Ralph's, Harris Teeter, Fred Meyer, King Scoopers. Albertsons owns Safeway and Vons. In statements on Tuesday, the companies argued the courts erred in their judgment and said they were evaluating their options. Tuesday's first ruling is a big win for the Federal Trade Commission. It, together with several states, has asked the federal court in Oregon to stop the merger. The government argued that the resulting colossus would lead to higher food prices and fewer choices for shoppers and workers. In many markets, the two chains are each other's biggest rival. Kroger and Albertsons, in turn, have argued that together they would actually have power to lower prices, as well as to compete against other huge retailers that sell food, including Walmart, Costco, and Amazon. U.S. District Judge Adrian Nelson on Tuesday ruled that the merger must halt while it undergoes the administrative review inside the FTC, a procedure that Kroger is separately challenging in court as unconstitutional. About an hour later, a Washington state court judge separately ruled the merger violated the state's Consumers Protection Law. Both defendants gestured towards a future in which they would not be able to compete against ever-growing Walmart, Amazon, or Costco, Nelson wrote in her order. The overarching goals of antitrust law are not met. However, by permitting an otherwise unlawful merger in order to permit firms to compete with an industry giant. Together, Kroger and Albertsons have nearly 500,000 stores and employ some 720,000 people across 48 states. They particularly overlap in western states. Cases hinge on how Americans buy groceries. During the 3-week federal trial in the Portland courtroom, the FTC and the companies painted different views of the grocery market. Kroger and Albertsons described the merger as existential to survive. They argue that FTC's view of competition, focused on options a shopper might have in their neighborhood, was outdated in the wake of big box behemoths and the sprawl of dollar stores. Kroger officials testified that they typically compared their prices to Walmart rather than Albertsons and struggled to keep up given Walmart's ability to negotiate better deals with suppliers thanks to its scale. Walmart is the biggest seller of groceries in the U.S., followed by Kroger and Costco. The FTC, however, argued that someone who shops at Walmart, Costco, CVS, or even Trader Joe's likely still relies on their neighborhood supermarket. Government lawyers said enough people are concerned about the merger that the agency received an unprecedented 100,000 public comments. Federal officials also shared complaints raised by labor unions. Kroger and Albertsons are the rare unionized shops in retail. The companies argue that, in fact, serves as a reason as to why they should be allowed to unite to face up to bigger non-unionized rivals. But the FTC says a merger would give the companies much more power over contract negotiations, leading to lower pay and worse benefits. Questions about a plan to sell off some stores. The judge separately weighed the plan by Kroger and Albertsons to sell hundreds of their stores to a firm called C&S Wholesale Grocers as a condition of the merger, meant to appease regulators. The idea is to create a new grocery rival in markets where Kroger and Albertsons currently overlap. Therefore, a merger would eliminate competition. C&S, a grocery supplier, had agreed to buy 579 stores in 18 states and in Washington, D.C. But the FTC argued C&S would struggle to compete. The firm currently runs only 23 stores, mostly under the Piggly Wiggly brand, without much nationwide name recognition. Government lawyers shared internal notes in which C&S executives raised concerns about the quality of stores they would acquire. Kroger and C&S executives presented C&S as an experienced grocery company that could hit the ground running. Judge Nelson remains skeptical. There are serious concerns about CNS's ability to run a large-scale retail grocery business that can successfully compete against the proposed merger business, as it will require to offset the competitive harm of the merger, she wrote on Tuesday's order. Purchased 33 of them on the cheap because one of the buyers filed for bankruptcy protection within months of the deal. An Afghan museum that buried its artifacts after Taliban takeover is reborn online. At first, it was a small museum in a nondescript office building in Kabul, with a seemingly mundane collection, like a 14-year-old school books and black sandals. The teenager had died in Kabul in the 2015 attack on civilians by a branch of the Islamic State, ISIS-K, which has been responsible for several deadly campaigns in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The school books and sandals were among hundreds of items that belonged to Afghans who died in the many conflicts that had ruled the country. The physical facility, known as the Afghans Memory Home Museum, no longer exists. Because the Taliban had threatened the museum's organizers, they decided to close when the Taliban marched into Afghan's capital city in 2021 and took power. But the museum still survives. Documents and artifacts were hidden, buried and smuggled out of the country, and eventually a virtual incarnation emerged. In addition, some of the rescued artifacts were displayed at the UN Convention for the Afghan War Victims held in The Hague on December 3rd. Truth-telling and bearing witness are important, helping to acknowledge, honor, and memorialize what victims have suffered, and their resilience as survivors, said Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, addressing the event. Making memory boxes. The idea for the museum came from a non-profit group, the Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organization. We started contemplating what to do with these stories, how to share them widely, and we realized that survivors often made reference to certain objects and personal belongings, said Hadi Marifat, executive director of Arido. For instance, when a dead body was delivered to the family, they would describe the clothes he was covered in. They would save these items to remember their loved ones. The idea culminated in a permanent physical exhibit of personal items from various individuals. The ideas were displayed in containers that the museum calls memory boxes, alongside a note written by loved ones that describes the individual's personalities, hopes, and dreams. One memory box held a scarf, colorful pens, and pages of drawings by 15-year-old Asadullah Sharifeh, who was killed along with his brother in 2016 by a suicide bomber who pretended to sell ice cream. The note, left by his mother and teachers, describes Sharifeh as a very talented and hardworking boy, the pride of the school. When the Taliban returned to power 3 years ago, Arido made the decision to shut down the museum and hide its collection. Marifat remembers the night in August when he called his colleagues, a small number of activists and researchers based in Kabul. As the Taliban marched towards the Afghan capital, the government on the verge of collapse, they discussed the fate of their organization and museum. They had reason to be worried. In previous years, Arido had been vocal in their advocacy for war victims and survivors. A large constituency in Afghanistan, said Marifat, which earned them the ire of the Taliban. The organizers feared that because some of the victims had died in Taliban-related attacks, the Taliban might target the museum or confiscate evidence that might one day be used in war crime trials. They worked overnight, smuggling in some documents and artifacts and hiding the rest, many wrapped in plastic and buried in volunteers' yards. We were able to remove everything in the building, including the archives, said Marifat. We are still taking some of the materials out when we heard from colleagues the Taliban had entered the city. Not a single document or material reached the hands of the Taliban, he said, despite the fact that they came into their office the next day. Amid the Taliban's chaotic takeover, many of Marifat's colleagues were forced to leave the country. Marifat himself soon went to Canada, his ambitious project dismantled after years of hard work. Arido members, many in exile, envisioned a virtual museum. They began to create a digital record of the things they'd saved, photographing artifacts, scanning documents, and organizing case details for each person. Some of the collection remains inaccessible, hidden away in Afghanistan. Another major hurdle was reconnecting with the families who contributed to the memory boxes. Not being in touch with the victims or their families worries about the security for the people who have shared their story. We chose not to publish anything deemed risky to survivors, said Sofia Milosevic-Bilejevic, who helped with the project. She's a researcher at the nonprofit group Swiss Peace and focused on memorializing those who'd suffered in conflict. Marifat says he feels war victims have been neglected. For them, just to be acknowledged that they have suffered, lost loved ones is important, he said. Projects such as these have a real impact in building empathy towards victims, said Valerie Higgins, who directs the Sustainable Cultural Heritage Program in the American University of Rome. People can relate to everyday objects, she said. They understand that people are people, just like them. Higgins said the objective is to resensitize people in order to counter this narrative of apathy and hostility by saying they're real people. Milosevec Bijeveld hopes the project will remind the international community of its duty to hold perpetrators accountable for their crimes. Justice must not be sacrificed for the sake of peace, she said. Bijeveld realizes this could take decades or even longer. In the meantime, she said symbolic justice is important in the absence of criminal justice. She revolutionized medicine. Why isn't she a household name? Lydia Reader's The Cure for Women tells the story of a remarkable Dr. Mary Pujam Jacobi. It would be great, wrote a 10-year-old Mari Putam, circa 1852. I would do deeds so that after I passed into the world, that region beyond the grave, I should be spoken of with affection. She had accomplished the first part. Her greatness was undeniable. The Cure for Women is a valiant and timely effort to change the fact that 120 years after her death, few people speak of her at all. Determined to train as a physician at the highest level, in 1868, Putnam, a daughter of prominent New York publisher George Palmer Putnam, was the first woman to persuade the Sorbonne to admit her into its medical school. With one exam left to take as the Second Empire fell, she elected to stay in Paris through the siege. Back in America, she became a fiercely uncompromising professor of medicine, practitioner of women's health care, alongside her mentors Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell at their New York infirmary and its affiliated women's medical college. Ignoring the general assumption that someone unwomanly enough to pursue a medical career couldn't possibly attract a husband, Putnam married the pioneering pediatrician Abraham Jacobi, capturing his heart with her research in cardiology and ignoring the anti-Semitism that came with her choice. In 1876, she was the first woman to win Harvard's prestigious Boswellian Medical Prize. The provocative essay topic, Do Women Require Mental and Bodily Rest During Menstruation?, was central to the larger women's rights movement. Womanhood itself was considered a kind of pathology. How could women claim equality if their own bodies betrayed them every month? Punjabi's Jacobi's meticulously argued conclusion that menstruation is an aspect of health, not illness, turned the prevailing wisdom upside down. She did it with data, sending out questionnaires asking respondents about their periods. How long did they bleed? How much? Did it hurt? How far could they walk? How many hours did they spend at work? In school? She recorded volunteers' heart rate, muscle strength, and temperature. Menstruation was no obstacle to achievement, Putnam Jacobi confirmed, nor did gynecological problems result from female ambition. Using the mind did not steal vital energy from the womb, and the men who insisted this zero-sum connection were, as she wrote with trademark tartness, reducing women to the anatomical level of the crustacea. During this year of intense research, not incidentally, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. In her own practice, she battled the misogyny of celebrity doctors like Esquire Mitchell, a champion of the rest cure, who treated his affluent clientele of neurasthenic ladies with isolation, bed rest, massage, force-feeding, electric shocks, and his own domineering charisma. He sent them home with instructions to live as domestic life as possible, exactly the kind of stifling existence that made his patients unwell in the first place. One of them, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, would write, The Yellow Wallpaper, a horror story born of her own treatment that became a classic early feminist text. In a satisfying turn, Gilman's work inspired Putnam Jacobi to offer her medical services. Her prescription of study, drawing, writing, and delightfully basketball restored her patient's sense of agency. Outside the consultant room, Putnam Jacobi worked to improve lives on a scale far beyond the individual, galvanizing a network of powerful friends into underwriting the admission of female students to medical school and lending her strategic mind to the suffrage movement. There was tragedy. Her beloved son died, age 8, from diphtheria, while her husband, the preeminent expert on the disease, stood by powerless to save him in an era before vaccines. Her final published paper, written in her early 60s, was titled Description of the Early Symptoms of the Meningeal Tumor Compressing the Cerebellum, which the author died written by herself. It's hard to imagine a more complete commitment to medicine. Putnam Jacoby's life story was everything: ambition, partnership, triumph, and loss. What's missing, to the chagrin of the biographer, is the kind of archival depth, journals, letters, diaries that allows access to unfiltered emotion and makes a subject's passions and peculiarities jump off the page. Reader tells Putnam Jacoby's story with uncritical enthusiasm and relies heavily on the work of previous scholars. She digresses at the length into the lives of the parallel figures. Tangling her chronologically, she indulges in sentimental moments of seeming speculation. Sometimes, while they worked, their hands touched, causing Mary to feel electrified. Reader writes in Putnam Jacoby's first love. Better to let her subject's electrifying record speak for itself. The Careful Woman reintroduces its subject as a hero for this moment. With relentless hard work, hard science, and sharp analysis, Putnam Jacoby changed the ancient narrative that men had written for women. Writing a better narrative for women remains an urgent task. Resist Trump? On immigration, top Democrats see room for compromise. In interviews, a range of Democrat governors expressed some defiance towards the president-elect's expected crackdown, but also showed a surprising willingness to work with him. As President-elect, Donald J. Trump promises to deport millions of undocumented immigrants. Democratic governors are bracing themselves to be on the front lines of an emotional and politically explosive battle against his administration. Unlike 8 years ago, when Democrats often vowed to protect immigrants in sanctuary cities and resist Mr. Trump was a driving political force, the party governors are now charting a more careful course. In interviews, 11 Democratic governors, governor-elects, and candidates for the office often express defiance towards Mr. Trump's expected immigration crackdown, but are also strikingly willing to highlight areas of potential cooperation. Several balanced messages of compassion for struggling migrants with a tough-on-crime tone. They said that they are willing to work with the Trump administration to deport people who have been convicted of serious crimes, and they wanted stricter border control, even as they vowed to defend migrant families and those fleeing violence in their home countries, as well as business that rely on immigrant labor. Describing his posture towards Mr. Trump on issues including immigration, Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey promised to fight like hell over here if our values are unfairly attacked, if communities are unfairly attacked. But he added, and then over here, fight like heck to find common ground. This measured approach reflects the political and logistical complexities for Democratic governors as they navigate immigration policy. Most of them have seen rising numbers of migrants strain public services in some of their cities and have adjusted their tones and policies towards immigration in the 8 years since Trump was first elected. A Siena College poll of New York State released Tuesday found that 54% of voters said the state should support Trump's administration efforts to deport migrants living illegally in the state, with just 35% opposed. The governor's responses also amount to a tact acknowledgement that Mr. Trump's election signaled a desire among voters for tougher positions on immigration. Some Democratic voters suggested that his second administration would be more experienced than his first and was likely to be savvier about how to achieve his policy goals. So the governors warned that Mr. Trump's broad plans on immigration were dangerous, and they argued that his victory did not mean that voters now rejected humanitarian concerns. They promised to push back on requests to use state detention centers or the National Guard, setting up potential conflicts with the Trump administration. An impassioned Governor Gavin Newsom of California suggested that in his state, Mr. Trump's threats of deportation had already so frightened immigrants that some were skipping life-saving medical care out of fear of being deported. Mr. Newsom grew emotional, tears welling and his face turning scarlet. "I'm going to have the back of those folks every goddamn second of the day," he said. But at other points in the interview, Mr. Newsom discussed the complexity of federal versus state immigration authority. He pledged to work to deport violent criminals. He said he would not be a blind obstructionist to the Trump administration, and reiterated his desire for tighter control of the border. Other Democratic governors who spoke with the New York Times last week during a gathering of the Democratic Governors Association in Beverly Hills, California, adopted similar tones. Some even proactively highlighted their support for deporting undocumented immigrants convicted of violent crimes, a subject Mr. Trump brought up relentlessly on the campaign trail. That political tactic, which he used in 2016 and 2020 campaigns and ratcheted up this year, had been criticized as inflammatory but appeared to have left Democrats on the defense. "If he wants to deal with criminal activity that's related to the border, I'm a phone call away," said Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham of New Mexico. "I know he's got my number. Happy to chat." Governor Kathy Hochul of New York a state where waves of migrants bust from Texas helped change the politics of immigration, said she wanted undocumented people who are convicted of crimes to complete their sentences before being deported. I want them to go through our criminal justice because they could go over across the border and be back the next week without any consequences. Exit polls from the November election found that roughly 40% of voters supported deporting most undocumented immigrants, though a vast majority of those who said so, 87%, were Republicans. Some governors suggested that they would need to work with the Trump administration to keep federal funding flowing to urgent projects in their states. Mr. Murphy of New Jersey said he had invited the president-elect to ribbon cutting next year of the bridge paid for by the federal money. It was a striking turnaround for a politician who, during his first campaign as governor in 2019, declared that New Jersey would be a sanctuary state, a term he had not used since he was elected. Yet Mr. Murphy said he would aim to block Mr. Trump from deporting undocumented immigrants who are in New Jersey and have not been convicted of crimes. One thing we won't do is sell out our values, Mr. Murphy said. Just because you're finding common ground doesn't mean that you won't find the backbone to stand tall on stuff that really matters. Agreement with the Trump administration clearly had its limits. With red lines on immigration policy quickly emerging, nearly all of the governors pledged to use their authority to halt any revival of Mr. Trump's first-term practice of separating migrant families at the border. I will not be part of separating families, rounding up kids in school, or people who have been here, law-abiding for a long time, Ms. Hochul said. We will not be part of that. Democrats who are running for governor did little to temper where they would stand. Kids in cages, red line for me, said Representative Mickey Sherrill in New Jersey, a Democrat running to replace Mr. Murphy, who is term limited. Losing children in the system is sort of a punitive measure for people crossing our southern border, certainly a red line for me. That was really horrible. One of her rivals in the Democratic primary race, Representative Josh Gottheimer of New Jersey, said that while it's one thing to go after criminals, it's another to broadly round people up, which I don't think anyone I know supports. Several Democrat governors said any federal attempts to use state resources to conduct mass deportations or to use state prisons to detain undocumented immigrants who were arrested under new Trump policies were likely to be rejected. It's not closed fist, but nor is it just tell us what to do and we'll do it, Mr. Newsom said. And there's some states that are saying we'll coordinate deportation camps and we'll turn over police as deportation officers. That's not their job. That's the federal government's job, not our job. Governor Gretchen Whitmire of Michigan said she would be very reluctant to commit state law enforcement officers to a mass deportation effort. In addition to the humanitarian concerns, many governors voiced a worry that targeted immigrants who are key workers in many important industries could hurt the economy. It would create real economic challenges, said Governor-elect Josh Stein of North Carolina. I talk to business folk all the time. We're a growing state. We're blessed to be a growing state. Tons of construction happening. I think it would have real ramifications on the cost of construction and other forms of labor. Mrs. Whitmer said, we have a lot of people that cross the border from Canada into Mission to provide health care to Michiganders. Mr. Trump's campaign promises on immigration were vast and aggressive, and their sheer scare has left many Democrat governors taking a wait-and-see approach, even as they scramble to prepare for all scenarios. Mrs. Hochul said her team had been told to look at every executive order that's on the books, every policy we have, every law that's on the books, to find out what the current status is, where we might need to enhance protections. Ms. Lujan Grissom spent minutes exploring different avenues to slow a deportation effort, including guarding data, directing the state police elsewhere, pursuing litigation, and applying political pressure. New Mexico has more privacy protection than the U.S. Constitution, said Lujan Grissom. So then, they have to overturn my constitution. Then they have to think about overturning all the other states' constitutions. That's a lot of stuff. Monarch butterflies are recommended for protected status. They become the most commonly seen species to receive federal protection if the proposal is adopted. Federal wildlife officials proposed on Tuesday that monarch butterflies receive protection as a threatened species. The flashy orange and black butterflies, which flutter forth each year on the epic migration that spans thousands of miles and multiple generations, are found from coast to coast in the United States during warmer months. Despite precipitous declines, they are still prevalent enough that if the proposal gets through, they become the most commonly seen species to receive federal protection. That means officials are walking a tightrope with the proposal. restrict too few activities that harm monarchs, and the officials risk creating a merely symbolic listing that does little to starve off further declines. Restrict too many, and they could trigger a political backlash. Tight rules could also backfire by dissuading people from creating butterfly habitat on their property because the presence of protected species could expose them to liability. There aren't many species where everyday people in their backyard can do something to help an endangered species, said Jake Lee, who offers efforts to list endangered species at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's one thing that makes monarchs so different and why we want to put a heavier thumb on the scale of incentives for people to help us conserve the species. The fate of the proposal will ultimately depend on the new administration in Washington. Under Donald J. Trump's first presidency, wildlife officials found that monarchs met their criteria for listing under the Endangered Species Act, but they were not placed under protection because other species were deemed to have priority. There is some debate among scientists over the status of North American monarchs and what is driving observed declines in wintertime populations. To assess the species, a team of federal biologists reviewed hundreds of studies and conducted their own modeling, said Kelly Mayo, a biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service who helped the effort. The team estimated that over the next 60 years, North American monarchs east of the Rocky Mountains have 56 to 74% probability of hitting the point where extinction appears inevitable. For those to the west, the probability was 99%. The primary drivers affecting the butterflies, the assessment found, were the loss and degradation of breeding, migratory, and overwintering habitat, exposure to insecticides, and the effects of climate change. It's not any one of those in particular, but these key threats work in combination with each other that we think are causing the decline. Wildlife officials, conservationists, and many monarch scientists are calling on the public to help by planting food for monarchs, native milkweeds, which the caterpillars rely on, and a variety of other native flowers that bloom throughout the warmer months to offer nectar to the adult butterflies. Tropical milkweed is best avoided, experts say, especially in areas where it does not die back during the winter, luring monarchs to keep breeding instead of migrating. The proposal punts on action related to pesticide use, asking for public comment on what measures are warranted. Activities like ranching, agricultural work, and gardening are protected by language that allows for the management of milkweed and nectar plants, even though it could result in monarch deaths. The proposal does not allow killing monarchs for the conservation of natural grasslands, shrublands, or forests without a permit, a condition that could lead to restriction on developers. The danger to monarchs, scientists agree, is not global extinction. Populations of the species exist in the wild outside of their native North American range. They've been introduced by people or blown by winds to places as distant as Hawaii, Spain, and Australia. What's at stake is their remarkable migration, which can span up to 3,000 miles between overwintering grounds in central Mexico and summer breeding grounds into Canada. If the migration collapses, the butterflies would likely persist in certain areas of the southern United States, several scientists said, but their numbers would be greatly diminished. In 2022, the International Union for Conservation of Nature's Red List, the scientific authority on the status of species, announced that it had listed the migratory monarch as endangered, but later reclassified it as vulnerable, a less acute category. Canada listed the species as endangered in 2023. In Mexico, it has a status of special protection. Greg Mitchell, a research scientist within the Canadian government who studies monarchs, visited their overwintering grounds in Mexico last year, where he expected to see butterflies coating the trees. Instead, he found himself in what felt like an empty cathedral. I've seen 2 previous times and seen millions. The tree branches drooping, Dr. Mitchell said. Last year, he didn't see a single cluster. It was devastating, he said. The winter could turn out to be the second lowest on record, apparently driven by dry, hot conditions in the United States and Canada that reduce the quality of milkweed and nectar plants. Monarchs return to Mexico each year holds greater cultural significance among indigenous communities there, where the butterflies are associated with visiting ancestors, said Rebecca Quinones-Pignon, who works on monarch recovery in the National Wildlife Federation. Losing the migration means losing deep-rooted traditions, and that's huge, Dr. Quinones-Pignon said. Some monarch researchers say concerns for the species and even the migration are overblown. Insect populations tend to fluctuate sharply, they note, and monarchs are bounced back from alarmingly low numbers before. Butterfly survey data from their summer breeding grounds don't show the sharp drops observed in the overwintering zones, and those winters don't include populations of butterflies that aren't part of the migration but could rejoin one day, said Anrong Arwal, a professor of ecology at Cornell University. But other monarch scientists are not reassured. Non-migratory populations have higher rates of disease. Data from the summer counts may be biased because of where it's collected, they said. And even if species have rebounded during the summer so far, the butterflies are only as strong as their weakest links. That's all that we have for today. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.